Hello, my name is Eric Csapo, and I'm going to talk to you today about how material evidence has changed our view of classical Greek theater. If there's one thing we learn about the classical Greek theater, it is that it was big, round, and built of stone. We learn that the heart of the theater is the big circle called the orchestra or dancing place, in which the choruses of tragedy and comedy danced and sang. Around it, in a half or two-thirds circle, stood the auditorium or Theratron, and bordering the orchestra circle on the other side was the Skene building, the backdrop against which the actors performed, fitted with doors to represent a palace or a house. Such big round stone theaters can be found throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The theater of Epidoris is the classic example. It is big, round, and perfectly proportioned. So why do I seem to have a problem with this? Well, the problem is that Epidaurus and all other big round stone theaters were built in or after the later 4th century BC, more than 70 years after the deaths of Sophocles and Euripides. They are not really classical Greek theaters at all, and do not represent the theaters our 5th century BC playwrights performed in. The roundness of these theaters has always sparked the imagination, for architecture round is bold, monumental, perfect proportion, and as many point out, democratic. The roundness of the orchestra has a particular symbolic, even mystic appeal. Very old and popular theory holds that the first orchestras were marble threshing floors. The first choral performances were accordingly at harvest festivals and concerned with fertility. These threshing floors became theatral areas and came to be attached to sanctuaries of fertility gods. The present excavator of the sanctuary of the great gods at Samothrace believes she has found a remnant of this early stage of development. At Athens, we might suppose such a circle became attached to Dionysus's sanctuary. We learn that the distinctive hymn for Dionysus, called the ditheran, was also known as the circular chorus. What's more, Aristotle says that tragedy developed from the ditheran. Thus, when the excavators of the theater of Epidaurus cleared its round orchestra floor, they performed a round dance for the international press, as if to announce the rebirth of the ancient theater. It all fits so nicely together. The circular dancing floor is the egg that produced the round dance that produced tragedy, antiquity's greatest cultural achievement. The same line of thought allows scholars to describe the rest of theater history in terms of the gradual loss of that original roundness. As the actors gained in importance at the cost of the chorus, the circles gradually began to shrink down, first to horseshoe shapes with the encroachment of the proscenium buildings in front of the stage buildings. Then, in Roman times, the stage buildings grew even larger, and the orchestra shrank to barely a semicircle. Birth, blossom, and decline, all in a geometric metaphor. It fits so nicely together, but it isn't true. Our ancient texts make it quite clear that the theater in Athens was not built in stone until the late 4th century. Athens's stone theater is no earlier than the other early monumental stone theaters. A history of the theater based on circles was well established by the time the theater of Dionysus at Athens was excavated in the later 19th century. Few doubted, therefore, that the big marble round theater that emerged was the theater of Sophocles and Euripides. Even when the most important scientific excavator of the Athenian theater, Wilhelm Dörpfeld, confirmed in 1896 that the stone theatre at Athens was not built until the later 4th century BC, scholarship nonetheless continued to assume only minimal differences between the 5th century and 4th century theatres. Even those who accepted that the 5th century theatre at Athens was built of wood nonetheless continued to think of it as big and round. In fact, it was believed the orchestra circle of the 5th century was even larger than in the 4th. It seemed reasonable to assume that all these later theatres copied the 5th century theatre at Athens. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides must have performed their dramas in perfectly proportioned big, round, and marble theatres. Surely, the argument goes, the architects produced such grand settings to match the poetic grandeur of their plays. How did this view change? For a very long time, we knew no theatres built before about 350 BC. But some have been found and excavated, most of them in the last 50 years or so. A few are in rural Attica, the hinterland of Athens. The earliest of these is the theatre of Thoracos. It dates back to the time of Aeschylus. This is the world's oldest surviving theatre building. It is built of stone, probably because it is built into a hill that is composed of a soft limestone that can be easily shaped. Though it has rounded edges at the corners, notice that the lines of the auditorium or Theratron are mostly straight, and that the shape of the orchestra is rectangular, or more properly speaking, trapezoidal. The same is true of our second oldest theatre in the town of Vicarion in Attica. Here, the only parts made of stone are the first row of seats, and the retaining walls in the auditorium and the foundations of the stage building. But the orchestra is an irregular and mainly trapezoidal shape. Of the auditorium, only the front seats survive because they alone were made of stone. The rest of the auditorium was made of wood. There are other theatres, like that at Roundness, where the only stone seats were in the first row and the rest were wooden. Roundness also had a trapezoidal orchestra. A fourth example from Attica is the Cedar Theatre you see here at Euonymon, built around 400 BC. The orchestra is rectangular. There are stone seats in the first row, and beyond that, there are stone slabs probably meant to support wooden benches. Outside of Attica, there are a few other surviving 5th and 4th century theatres, and they are also trapezoidal or rectangular theatres. At Isthmia or Calydon, for example. At Calydon, you can see in the center of the photograph, the square orchestra. But as one moves from the orchestra towards the letter A, the corners get gradually rounder. Sometimes we also find traces of 5th and early 4th century theatres underneath the later built round theatres. These earlier phases also show a Theratron with straight lines, as at Syracuse or Argos. In short, all of the remains of theatres that were built in Greece before the middle of the 4th century BC are more rectangular than round. Of the 5th century Athenian Theratron, only 8 stones survive. They survive because they were reused for a drain when the theatre was rebuilt. They belong to the front row of seating in the classical auditorium. We can tell because they're inscribed with the names of civic officials and priests were given front row seats as a privilege of office. Their wooden seats would have been placed upon these slabs. The interesting thing about these blocks is that they are worked at both ends so as to fit with other blocks in a perfectly straight line. From this, we must infer that the 5th century Athenian Theratron was also rectilinear. The parts of the 5th and early 4th century theatre that survive because they are in stone. But we know of many more theatres than we have remains for. Some of these were completely removed when the theatres were enlarged and rebuilt in later times, but many do not survive because they were built mainly of wood. We know, in fact, that apart from the first row of seats, the classical theatre in Athens was built of wood. The 5th century comic poets Aristophanes and Cratinus both refer to the audience sitting on Icria, a term used only of temporary wooden stands of seats. The word Icria is never used of permanent seating. The Icria were designed to be easily set up and taken down each year for the theatre season. We even hear of the entrepreneurs who bought the franchise to set up the stands and then sell the seating in the theatres of Athens and Piraeus. For 2 centuries of theatre history, scholars paid little attention to these facts, but one can ignore them no longer. Greek archaeologists working in the theatre of Athens from 2000 to 2012 cut a few test trenches underneath the 4th century stone Theratron. What they discovered in several parts of the Theratron was large holes that had once received posts to hold up the stands of wooden seating. A new but clear picture emerges. The classical Greek theatre, even that at Athens, was not big, round, and stone, but much smaller, rectangular, and wooden. The great 5th century Athenian tragedies were performed in practical, not monumental theatres. Wooden, rectilinear, functional, and temporary all go together. Untreated wood does not last. It is put up and taken down to preserve it from rot and weathering. And if it is not going to last, it's not worth shaping. The monumental big round stone theatres came much later when the city-states saw the economic and social benefits of theatre and decided to invest heavily in it and themselves take the money for seating. Both the material and textual evidence are abundantly clear, but old ideas die hard. There are many who deny and many who still partly deny these conclusions. Even the excavator of the post holes in the Athenian theatre has recently declared that, apart from being wooden and rectilinear, the 5th century theatre was just as large and grand as the late 4th century theatre. The more reliable modern reconstructions put the theatre of Sophocles and Euripides on a rather modest scale, about half the size of the theatre that was built over it in the mid-4th century. Still big enough to hold perhaps 8,000 viewers, the classical theatre of Dionysus at Athens was well short of the 17,000 viewers permitted by the later stone theatre. What should we learn from this? That theatres were once small, square, and wooden, and only later became big, round, and stone, and that great plays can be written for simple surroundings. Most importantly, It's a good example of how long-held preconceptions can become so tightly woven into our historical narratives that it takes a long time to extricate them and straighten the narrative, if they can be extricated at all.